almost 5 years ago, we released our first report on residential boarding schools in Tibet, showing that schooling in Tibet today is mostly residential. With approximately 1 million Tibetan children, at least 78% of students living separated from their parents and families in the state-run boarding system. But what we didn't know with any certainty, due to China's near total information blackout on Tibet, was the actual conditions in the schools. Sadly, our second report reveals new evidence of children facing serious abuse and neglect. Loss of language to the extent that one person describes Tibetan children in his area as like kids raised in a foreign country. Parents unable to parent or protect their children, prevented from helping them when they're sick, unable to intervene to stop abuse, not even allowed to decide what they can do when they're home on vacation. And children are experiencing alienation that is leading to deep psychological and emotional harm. Recently, we received an account from a former student that speaks to the extent of both routine abuse and extreme violence that children in the schools face. A monk until his parents were forced to send him to boarding school, he describes how difficult it was to be away from home, especially in grade 1 and 2, constantly missing his parents, home, and having to be responsible for everything on his own. He said, quote, "When it came to bullying and punishment, the environment was quite severe. Injuries such as broken hands, fractured fingers, bruised backs were common. Over time, students began to normalize this treatment and rarely told their parents. It was so widespread that no single incident stands out. There are simply too many," end quote. Eventually, this child and several others tried to escape from the boarding school and return to the monastery, but they were caught by police, taken to a police station, beaten, tortured with an electric device before being returned to the boarding school. Our report highlights many other cases of abuse, including children being beaten for wearing Buddhist protection cords around their necks, for saying prayers, children becoming deaf after being hit too many times on their ears and their heads. And we've documented multiple cases of suicide, attempted suicide, and death because of abuse and neglect. The Canadian former UN Special Rapporteur for Minority Rights called this system of schooling an existential threat for Tibetans and said that he is not afraid to use the word cultural genocide. He said this, I quote, "I want to emphasize this is a massive in scale, but massive in terms of the grave violations of the human rights of children and their families and the individuals involved to a scale which is actually almost inconceivable. Canada should investigate sanction and put visa restrictions on Chinese officials who are designing or implementing these policies that are intended to erase Tibetan identity, and also on the authorities at the schools where physical abuse and negligence is known to be taking place. And with China's upcoming review by the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, Canada needs to work with like-minded governments to increase pressure on Beijing to abolish the colonial boarding schools system and to guarantee access to culturally and linguistically appropriate education for Tibetan children while they live at home. Thank you.
Thank you. Very well respected. And now I would like to invite Mr. Gya Lo to take the floor for 2 minutes, please.
Today I plan to do a follow-up testimony about what is happening to Tibetan children through China's colonial boarding school in Tibet. In 2016, my family children, my 2 grandnieces, being sent to the colonial boarding preschool. After 3 months, they both became a stranger at home. Let me share my personal experience with those 2 grandnieces. 1 year before, when I was visiting my home, those 2 kids jumped on me without hesitation. But in 2016 November, late November, just after 3 months, my brother asked me to come home to check what kind of a change that caused my 2 grandnieces. And then I went to school gate to pick up them. The first time they gave me eye contact, then no more emotional exchange. When I took them to home, they did not exchange any emotion with their grandparents, parents. During the dinner time, they're being silent and kept distance with our family member. It seems that they are not already lost the ability of merging the conversation with their family members. At the same time, they seem uncomfortable, start to feel uncomfortable to share the same identity with their parents or family members. That's where I see the serious change. One is the lost language means the cultural genocide start with them from home. And the second part is the racial genocide. I can see it's not the physical, but the cultural. They start rejecting or hesitating to share the common identity with family members. So that after 10 years, those kids who been in the boarding preschool in Tibet, they start criticizing their family member who are not able to speaking Chinese Mandarin. That's the serious shift. It's a generation because those boarding school policies are implemented across Tibet as a part of compulsory education. And then since last year, the school asks preschooler to spy on their parent, who emphasize the mother tongue when they come home from boarding school. And then kids report to the school communicate with the local government puts the political pressure on their parent. That's how they circulate the pressure, by cutting off the language from the home between the children and their parents.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I would like to invite Mrs. Chemi Lamu to take the floor for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Picture a 6-year-old, a child in grade 1 or maybe even in kindergarten. Now imagine that very young child living in a boarding school, going through a shockingly rigorous 12-hour schedule, day after day, separated from their parents and family, having to study in a completely foreign language and often facing extreme abuse. This 6-year-old may get to go home on the weekends, but cannot go to any houses of worship nor speak their own language, their own mother tongue, even to their parents. Any engagement in religious practice is not allowed, and when they return to school, they're asked to tell the teachers if the parents are breaking the rules. This is the reality of a 6-year-old child inside Tibet. Tibetan parents have no choice but to send their children to these residential boarding schools. If they refuse, they will be harassed, threatened, and face imprisonment. Now to the reality here in Canada. The Chinese government has passed a law that openly declares a war on anyone who is not Chinese and tries to maintain their distinct identity. At the same time, the Chinese government has stolen approximately 1 million Tibetan children from their families and placed them in these boarding schools where they're facing severe political indoctrination, physical and psychological abuse and neglect. And yet, the government of Canada has backseated the issue of human rights in the recent dealings with the PRC. Namely, the Prime Minister's visit to China and the Chinese Foreign Minister's subsequent visit to Canada. It has to be said that this strategy seems short-sighted and flawed. It's not megaphone diplomacy that we're seeking. It's really a reality check of Xi Jinping's predominant interest, which is really to consolidate and expand control at all costs, not a trustworthy trading partner for Canada. Michael Kovrig explains this quite well in his Foreign Affairs article. By subordinating security and human rights to immediate commercial gain, these governments, Canada and our allies, are exposing their citizens to foreign interference, arbitrary detention, and transnational repression with diminishing prospects for recourse. This subordination has very real consequences here in Canada for us. Whether it is the experiences of attacks such as death threats and rape threats that I received when I was running for student leadership at the University of Toronto Scarborough campus, or threats to dissidents like Dr. Jello, who probably represents the single greatest threat to the CCP and its hidden policies of erasure that are only now coming to light. Tibetans know all too well when we are dealing with the Chinese government, the road of accommodation only leads to further accommodations, further concessions that will be detrimental to our Canadian economy, our own citizens, and our institutions, and the most vulnerable and marginalized people who are suffering under the Xi Jinping's rule. Despite that, Tibetans inside of Tibet have defied all odds in their fight to protect all that they hold dear, especially our language, culture, and Buddhist traditions. They face the real and devastating consequences for their resistance, and yet they do not stop. All they need from us is our moral courage and support in action, now more than ever. I truly do believe in Canada, who has, one, the responsibility, but two, also the opportunity to pursue a principled, realistic foreign policy approach to China that really balances the economic and national security while upholding our own core values. This begins by drawing a red line. Red line when it comes to the abuse and incarceration of children in a residential school system designed to erase their language, culture, and identity, far too similar to our own Canadian shameful residential school system. The colonial boarding school system inside Tibet must be stopped. And I really ask this committee, Foreign Minister Anand, the Prime Minister Connie, to use every available parliamentary and foreign policy mechanism available to condemn and oppose these schools. This could begin with Prime Minister ensuring that China's colonial boarding schools and the new ethnic erasure law are condemned in the upcoming G7 leaders' statement in this month, right? And ensuring that Canada is on record with either a report, press release, or statement from this very committee ahead of the China's Rights of the Child review at the UN, calling for the colonial boarding schools to be abolished and for Tibetan children to be able to go to school in their own language and live in their own homes. Or else China won't stop. That 6-year-old child I described earlier, who was forced to sing the Chinese nursery rhymes and then cries themselves to sleep, and very
Can you
softly.
wrap it up, please? Time
Yep.
is up.
And they cry themselves softly to sleep because they're afraid that someone will hear. The children that miss their parents and have no one to explain them the meaning of their own name, where they were born, or who they are as Tibetan, they're counting on your action.